Okay, so we are in Chavav Madal of 26a at the bottom. So what the Gemara is doing is going through various different scenarios described in the Mishnaic text in the Tosefta we learned a couple of days back. And there were a number of cases in which the text simply stated, this woman qualifies as a Sotah. And in each of these cases, the Gemara is asking, it seems to be obvious that they qualify as Sotah. They're a normal marriage. The issue at hand, at least as we understood it from the beginning, is the fact that Torah says in order to qualify as a Sotah, they must be husband and wife. And therefore, we went through various relationships in which Torah doesn't approve of their marriage. And we say, well, even though they're technically married, they aren't a bona fide husband and wife, and therefore they may not qualify as a Sotah. But then this Mishnaic text seemed to describe a number of relationships in which they are a bona fide husband and wife. And if they are a bona fide husband and wife, obviously she can count as a Sotah. Why would this Mishnaic text, the Tosefta, then tell us to commit to memory? You should remember this woman qualifies as a Sotah. And in each case, the Gemara introduces a mistaken way of thinking about it. And that is the reason why the Mishnaic text needs to correct us, so that we don't make that mistaken way of thinking. The most recent of this was, the last one we did yesterday, is the woman married to a Kohen. The Tosefta, this Mishnaic text read, Mishnaic era text, said that a woman married to a Kohen counts as a Sotah. She can either drink the water or volunteer not to drink the water and lose her ketubah, like any other married woman, after becoming a Sotah. And the Gemara asked, well, why wouldn't she be a Sotah? It seems to be obvious. This is a normal marriage. A Kohen married to a woman, what's the problem? So the Gemara explained like this. Here's the mistaken line of reasoning you would have thought, and you might have concluded that a woman married to a Kohen doesn't count as a Sotah. And therefore the Tosefta had to tell you, no, she does count as a Sotah. So here's the mistaken way of thinking. The verse states, in describing the process of the Sotah, says as follows. A man warns his husband, don't seclude herself with so-and-so. She does seclude herself with so-and-so. And there was no rape. Right? Then we go, I'm sorry, there was no rape. Yeah. Then she can go back home to her husband. No, I'm sorry, there was no rape, because if she was raped, God forbid, she would not qualify as a Sotah, and also she wouldn't be compelled to divorce. If she voluntarily was unfaithful, and we have witnesses to that effect, or the Sotah waters indicate that she was unfaithful, then they would separate, she'd lose her ketubah. But if there's rape, it's not her fault, God forbid, that this happened to her, so she can go back to her husband. That's the way the Torah frames the scenario of the Sotah. So I might have mistakenly thought as follows. When the Torah describes that she was not raped, it's not simply describing the circumstance, it's actually describing the law of who qualifies as a Sotah. Namely, only someone who after rape can go back to her husband, that's the kind of person who can qualify as a Sotah. Whereas a woman married to a Kohen who, God forbid, was raped, her husband would be forbidden to be with her. The Torah puts the Kohen at a higher standard, and he may not be with someone who earlier in her life, unfortunately, went through a traumatic experience of rape. The Kohen cannot be with her. So when the Torah describes a Sotah woman as having not been raped, is that just a description of the events, that she wasn't raped? Because if she was raped, then the Sotah law is off. Or is that also a qualifier as to who can count as a Sotah? Only the kind of woman who, God forbid, after rape, can still go back to her husband. And if that were the case, it would exclude one married to a Kohen. Because if a woman married to a Kohen was, God forbid, raped, she wouldn't be able to go back to her husband. That's the mistaken reason, mistaken logic I would have made had the Tosefta not told us, no. Even a woman married to a Kohen can still count as a Sotah. Even though if God forbid she was raped, she would not be able to go back to her husband. Nonetheless, she still counts as a Sotah. And as for the fact that the Torah says that the Sotah woman was not raped, it's not telling you what kind of woman qualifies. It's just telling you the reality of the story. The reality of the story of Sotah is when there's no rape, but not telling you the kind of woman who qualifies. That's what we did yesterday. This is where we left off yesterday. Yeah, is that clear? No worries. Now we come to the next statement. Second line of the wider set of lines. Umuteres labaila. The Mishnah said, the Tosefta, said that the woman married to a Kohen who we just established qualifies as a Sotah, after she drinks of the Sotah waters, she's permitted to go home and be with her husband. The Gemara asks, Pshita, is that not self-understood and obvious? That's the whole point of the Sotah law. The whole point of the Sotah law is to determine her innocence or guilt. After she drinks the water and nothing happened to her, presumably, then obviously she goes home to her husband. What's the point of the whole Sotah law, if not for that? So it seems to be self-understood. And why does the Tosefta have to tell it to us and make us to commit to memory that a woman who's married to a Kohen and she drinks the Sotah water and comes back home, she's allowed to go to her husband? Obviously. What else should she do? So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna says, there is one case in which we might have made the mistake in thinking that she may not go home to her husband. How's that? Bimisnavna. When she starts to, misnavna literally means she starts to become repulsive, meaning to say she starts to get sick. Yeah. Oh, now the text is clear. Misnavna, where she starts to become sick. And therefore, one second, so the Gemara asks 1 second, Misnavna, you're talking about she's getting sick? If she got sick, habat mayim, then that means the water indicates that the water did its job and she's guilty. Why should she go home to her husband? So, now Rav Huna says that when the Braita said, when the Tosefta said that the woman married to a Kohen may go home to her husband, it's coming to teach us that even if she starts to get sick, she still goes to her husband. The Gemara asks, if she starts to get sick, then is that not an indication that she's guilty? Why is she going home to her husband? She's guilty. Is that not the whole point of the water? To make her start getting sick if she's guilty? The Gemara explains, no. There's a unique kind of sickness here that leaves it ambiguous. Namely, she starts to get sick, but she starts to get sick not in the way that the Sotah is supposed to, which is from the stomach and the thighs, but rather she starts to get sick from other limbs, from her hands, from her feet. So, Mao de Tema, I might have left. So now I'm a little bit confused as to what exactly the Sotah water is doing. Had she got sick in her stomach, in her abdomen, as the Sotah water says it's going to, okay, then I know for sure she was guilty. Don't go home to your husband. But here she's getting sick from other parts of her body. So what is that an indication of? Like when we look at this woman, what do we think? We could just say, look, it just so happens that she got sick, nothing to do with her behavior behind closed doors. And if that's the case, go home to your husband, because this is not the Sotah sickness. But I still would have made a mistake, says the Gemara. Because Ma'od Tema, I could have falsely mistakenly come to the conclusion, she was unfaithful behind closed doors. And the fact that the waters did not investigate her, did not make her sick in the ordinary matter from the abdomen, is mishum de zinai, because her unfaithfulness was by force. A case of rape, God forbid. So in other words, the person looking at this woman, so there's a woman who's married to a Kohen. She becomes a Sotah, she drinks the water. And her hands and feet start to get sick. So the person looking at this says, okay, this happened right after she drank the water. Maybe she just happens, Maybe she just happened to get sick. Or maybe the water is telling us something about her. It's not telling us that she's a full-on unfaithful woman, because she didn't get sick from the abdomen as she should have. But maybe there's another issue here. And the water is telling us, hey, look out, there's another issue, by making her get sick in an unusual manner. And what's it telling us to look out for? Maybe it's telling us to look out for rape. And if that's the case, Legabe Kohen, if she was married to a Kohen, Asira, she'd be forbidden to go home. So Kamash Malan comes the Mishnah to tell us, no, unless the water investigates and unless the water demonstrates that she is guilty in the ordinary fashion of sickness from the abdomen, unless it does that, she's completely innocent, even if she happens to get sick right after. She's completely innocent and she can go back home to her husband. There was no rape even there. There wasn't even rape. That would make it a problem for a Kohen.
Those other sicknesses shouldn't tell us.
That's right.
To look out for rape.
The other sicknesses should not. That's right.
Else,
that's right.
Negative about the woman.
That's right.
What that would preclude her from being with her.
That's correct. By saying that, that's right. By the
Mishnah
say, that's right.
The Mishnah is telling us she can go home unless she's
that's right.
Sotah sickness.
By the Mishnah telling us after she drinks the water, she can go home, is telling us even if she's sick, she can still go home. And the sickness is no indication of anything wrong with her. And don't look out for anything, unless she gets sick in the manner that the Sotah water is supposed to make her sick, through the stomach and so on.
So that's the Shita.
And this resolves the Pshita. This resolves why it's not so obvious. And why the that's right. This resolves the Pshita.
These are all cases of resolution.
That's right. We're all these cases. That's right. That's right. These are all introducing mistaken ways of thinking of the law, and thus validating why the Mishnah has to tell us not to think in that mistaken way.
And that, like you said, the Mishnah is very concise. So you have to
must be concise, yeah.
These reminders.
That's right.
This oral tradition can be remembered.
That's correct. Okay. So following the same pattern,
right.
The next line is like this: Eisha Sodus Shoisa. The Tosefta told us that a woman married to a Sodus, meaning someone who's been who's infertile, meaning let's say had a vasectomy, let's say, something of that nature, or even if it wasn't voluntary, if something happened to him later in life, some condition that rendered him infertile.
Intentional, non-intentional.
Yeah, but not from birth. Not from birth. It happened to her later in life. It happened to him later in life. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, Sardis often refers to a castration, but it just means some sort of infertility. All right, let's look at Rashi.
It says here eunuch.
A eunuch, yeah.
Isn't that a person who has one testicle?
Is that what a eunuch is? I don't know, but Rashi doesn't say anything like that. It's just the point is he's no longer. The truth is it's not just not just that he's infertile. It's he's incapable of sexual activity. So it's more than just infertile. It's a form of castration. It's not literally castration, but something of that nature. Anyway, the Gemara said, the Tosefta told us that a person married to this guy, a woman married to this guy, Shoisa, she can count as a Sotah. She can drink the Sotah water, or again, relinquish her ketubah. So again, the Gemara asks, Pshita, obviously she would drink the Sotah water. Why wouldn't she? This is a bona fide marriage, notwithstanding the fact that as of now, he is incapable of sexual activity. But at least at one point, he was capable of sexual activity. And it must be that way, because we already established that in order for a person to qualify as a Sotah, husband and wife, before she is suspected, before she secludes herself with that other guy, the husband and wife have to have been intimate. Because if the husband and wife did not consummate their own marriage, she doesn't qualify as a Sotah. So certainly this husband at one point in time was capable of sexual activity, and they were intimate as husband and wife, but now is in a state where he's no longer capable of such activity. Here's where the Mishnah told us that she can qualify as a Sotah. And the Gemara asks, Pshita, it's obvious. I mean, this is a bona fide marriage, notwithstanding his present condition. So why wouldn't she qualifies as Sotah.
It was like those women who were once were able to have children, but no longer, right?
That's right.
So similar.
Yep. The Gemara answers, Mahadutema, here's the mistake I would have made. The verse reads, Mibalade Ishech. She is with the guy instead of her husband. Amar Achmana, this is what the merciful one said in Torah. This is what Torah says. Bahai, and this husband, La Bar Hachiyu, is not capable of performing that kind of husbandly duty. Because the verse describes the suspected infidelity of the woman as someone engaging instead of her husband, it means her husband is capable of this activity and she's suspiciously behaving with someone else. That's how I might have understood that verse. Because the verse, again, clear? Because the verse describes the suspected relationship as she is behaving suspiciously with someone in place of her husband, implying that whatever she's seeking from this other guy, her husband is capable of doing. She's just choosing this guy instead of her husband.
Is capable?
That's what we would have mistakenly thought.
Oh.
Again, because of this phrasing. She's suspected with someone instead of her husband, implying that her husband is capable of that activity, but she's being suspicious with someone else. That's what I would have mistakenly thought. And if that would be the correct reading, then being married to someone who's incapable of sexual activity would mean that she doesn't qualify as a Sotah. Following or not? Again, it's the same principle.
I'm trying to relate this to the case of, let's say, a man who's in prison.
Stop that for a second. No.
Wrong.
No, we're going in the wrong direction. Let's understand this first before we compare to anything else, right? We're looking at this text of the verse and describing the scenario.
Yeah, I don't see how.
Okay, so let's go through it. And the verse describes what the scenario is. And the question is, when the verse describes these scenarios, is it just describing what happened, or it's describing the qualifiers for how this halacha works? Now, one of the descriptions of what happens is she is suspected of lying with another man in place of her husband.
Okay.
That's a description. Now, is that just a description of what happened, that she's hanging out with another guy instead of her husband? Or is that a qualifier as to what kind of husband she has? She has to have a kind of husband who is capable of lying with her. Whether he's in prison or not is irrelevant. We're describing who he is. Is he a person capable of lying with her? That's the question. So if we look at these descriptions as qualifiers, when we describe that she went to suspect herself with a different man instead of her husband, and that's a qualifier that her husband must be capable of lying with her, then that would exclude someone married to a person who's incapable of sexual activity.
What was the verse? How does it read?
Mibalade ishech. She's suspected of being with another man in place of her husband.
And that we would mistakenly believe to mean
A description of who he is, who the husband is, because she's choosing someone else in place of her husband. So whatever she's suspected of is something her husband is capable of, but she's choosing the other guy instead of her husband.
That's what we would think.
That's what we would have thought. That the description of the story is a qualifier. It's the same principle as before with the Kohen. When we described a woman who wasn't raped, is that a description of the event? Or is that a description of the kind of woman who qualifies? But the kind of woman who qualifies is a woman who, if she was raped, would have been permissible for her husband. Same thing here. Are we describing the event that she's with someone instead of her husband? Or is that a qualifier about who her husband is? And if I would not have the Mishnah, I would mistakenly think it's a qualifier. That in order for her to count as a Sotah, she must be choosing against the husband who's capable of lying with her. And therefore, Kamash Malan comes the Tosefta, and the Mishnah tells us, no, it's not a qualifier. It doesn't matter whether he's capable of sexual activity or not capable of sexual activity. It's just a description of the events. She went to someone else instead of her husband. It's not a qualifier about who her husband is. Clear? Okay, Kamash Malan. Okay, one more. The next statement was, the Tosefta now went on beyond describing the husband and the wife, went to describing the person about which she's being warned. Who can he warn her about? So certainly any random guy, yes, he can warn her about any suspicious relationship with some other random person. But then the Gemara Mishnah told us, "Aidei kol arayis lekan." The husband can warn her. Sorry, with me?
Yeah, I was trying to understand the question, but go ahead.
Which question?
You said warn her about.
That's right.
Okay.
He's warning her about a certain person, don't hang out with this guy. Is she allowed to tell her not to hang out with her father? Is she allowed to tell her not to hang out with her cousin? Or is it only random strangers? Who is the person about whom he's allowed to warn her?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the Mishnah said, he can warn her against any relationship, even incestual relationships. Which means he can warn her against hanging out with her brother or secluding herself with her brother if he suspects something's going on. So the Gemara asks, again, Pshita, obviously, why can't he warn her? If there's a suspicious something going on between her and her cousin, or her and her uncle, or anything else, why can't he warn her?
In modern parlance, duh.
That's right. So top of Chavav Medbeis, top of 26b, the Gemara says like this. I would have thought, here's the mistaken way of thinking and why I might have concluded that he may not warn her, or that a warning is irrelevant in cases of familiar relationships. Why? Because of the following teaching. When the verse describes the Sotah law, it says twice, nitma'a, nitma. Shnei pamim. It says twice, she becomes impure, she becomes impure. And later on, the Gemara is going to teach us that this double expression, she becomes impure, and then again repeats itself, she becomes impure, is to teach us that once she, if there is infidelity, or even if there's suspected infidelity, let's say she didn't drink the Sotah waters, and they decided to go through a divorce, she's no longer allowed to go back to her husband, echad labal, one for her husband, the echad laboil, and another that she may not marry the person about which she was suspected. We're kind of we've discussed this before. It's going to come up later again in the Gemara, which is that we are disincentivizing such behavior. We don't want her to be, she behaves suspiciously while married, and then all of a sudden they get divorced, and now she marries the guy she was suspicious with. It's giving women the capacity to get out of their marriages in a very illicit way. Hang out with some other guy, force her husband to divorce her, and then go marry that guy. So therefore, we forbid her from marrying. She can't go back to her husband because she behaved suspiciously and perhaps even unfaithfully, and she can't even marry the guy about which she was suspicious.
You don't want to make incentive.
We don't want to incentivize it, yeah? Okay, so that's what we learned. That's what the Gemara tells us later. So says the Gemara now, okay, so now let's think about this. Again, is this a qualifier for the kind of relationship? Is this a qualifier for the kind of person about which we are warning her? Bahaznus. Perhaps the only people about which she can be warned in the beginning of the process of the Sotah is only the kind of person who, after becoming a Sotah, she would then become forbidden to him. When this teaching tells us that after a woman becomes a Sotah, she now no longer is allowed to marry her first husband, and nor can she marry the guy with which she was suspected. Is that teaching a qualifier? That you know who you're allowed to warn her against? Someone who right now you could marry in theory, but after I warn you, won't be able to marry her. But these in these ancestral relationships, because you're anyways not allowed to marry them. A malay, perhaps they don't qualify as a person about which you can warn, right? It's the same logic again and again, right? So this teaching that after a woman becomes a Sotah, she's no longer allowed to be with the guy about which she was suspected. Is that teaching simply a law that you can't marry that person after suspicion? Or does that also teach you the person about which you can be warned? You can only be warned about a person who after suspicion you can't marry. But someone who you can't marry anyway, no warning matters. namely a father, a brother. Clear?
So what is it teaching us that
So Kamash Malan, that even though this is someone who anyways is forbidden to her, he can still warn her about that relationship. And the warning isn't relegated to the kind of relationship that in theory would be permissible now, but after warning becomes forbidden. The warning can work even in a case where it's forbidden anyway.
It's not limited to legitimate.
That's right. It's not limited to legitimate relationships. I might have thought that it's limited to legitimate relationships.
Anyway.
Why? Because one of the consequences of Sotah law is that you can no longer marry the person about which you're suspected. Now does that consequence qualify who to begin with it works for? As in, it only works for someone who has this consequence. Meaning someone who I could have married, but now I can't because of the Sotah. Now we're learning, no, even if the consequence of she may not marry her exists before they even become a Sotah, because it's her brother, nonetheless, he can still warn her.
Because it's not so much of the remedy of not being able to marry that third party, but to be able to get out of the marriage.
That's correct.
Separate the marriage and the
That's correct.
issues.
That's correct. That's correct.
Right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we'll stop over here, God willing, with Hashem's help. And on Monday, we will look at the next interesting section of the Gemara, which is, Sotah told us that a woman can only be warned about secluding herself with another man, to the exclusion of a child. You can't warn her against hanging out with a child. And likewise, someone who, quote, is not a man. Who exactly is not a man? What are we suspecting her of?
Another woman?
Let's see. The Gemara is going to tell us.
That question there,
So that we're going to get tomorrow on Monday.
Yeshikov, Rabbi. God bless you. All the very best to you.
Good
Shabbat. All the very best to you, and all the very best to you, Yeshua.
Good Shabbos, Judge. Have a great Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Good news, Levi.